In every age, God raises people up to speak the truth to the world in a way that is currently relevant. Though our opinions should not be held with the same esteem as the biblical canon, we still carry the hope of Christ to the world. Our society has forgotten what it means to follow Christ. The bright lights of truth seekers are barely visible in the dim twilight of a post-Judeo-Christian society. We all see the darkness coming. All we can hope is to share the light that He has entrusted to us. This is Modern Apocrypha. Hey, I'm Jared.
And I'm Greg.
And this is Modern Apocrypha. And Greg doesn't know what we're talking about.
Yeah. I'm a free guinea pig today.
So what I wanted to go into, we were sort of chatting before we started this, and what I want to sort of focus on is something that it drives me crazy because I see it and most people don't seem to see it. I think you see it, at least to some degree, but most people don't seem to see it, and it makes me nuts. And we've talked about it plenty, but let's dig into it deeper. And that is, what actually is the dialectic doing right now, and what is it causing people to miss?
Okay. What is the dialectic doing right now, and what is it causing people to miss?
All right,
because it's pay attention to this, pay attention to that, pay attention to this, pay attention to that, and then you're like, well, what about what's behind me? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Okay, so the biggest example that I can think of right now on the front of people's minds, on the top of people's minds, is the most important election in history.
It does seem to be quite a bit of the discussion. Yeah. There's some discussion about changes in money, that being in the next big thing, the fall of the dollar and the rise of digital currencies of some kind being an expectation.
And the BRICS people trying to put together a currencies based on a basket of commodities, that's a thing. Another one
Sure.
is the whole gender war thing that we've talked about over and over again, where it's like men versus women is like bubbling under the surface and is turning into a disaster.
Versus public school. We have a homeschool versus public school fight going on right now, or another, sort of rediscussion of.
And that's an interesting one to me, because that could go in a couple of different directions, but that's a really interesting one to me, and I actually think that may be a wild card. But to start with, let's define the dialectic fairly carefully, okay? Because this is something that we don't get into enough depth on enough, because it's kind of the central point of the way we think about things. Okay, so I had somebody who I actually really like on Twitter, Joey Carrion, telling me that he doesn't buy the dialectic. And so I'm going to speak as if to Joey here. So when I say the dialectic, I don't mean necessarily what a lot of people mean. I use it as shorthand. And the way most people frame the dialectic is sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And the idea is that you have one side, another side, and when you get them together, you wind up with people being manipulated into what the people who were setting up the sides originally intended. And I do not believe that the dialectic...
This is something like the Republican Democrat Party, where you've got a two-party system. That's the easy one for everyone to pick out.
Right, it is. And I don't believe that this dialectic is set up by human forces. Okay, that's the first thing. I think that almost all of the time when you see two sides that are engineered to get people into a conflict, that it's something that's engineered by spiritual forces. We know in Revelation it says, and the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet were. And the idea here is that there is a force that has been deceiving humanity since time immemorial. It's a spiritual force that is responsible for most of the grand chessboard that is the world, where you have the light pieces and the dark pieces. And people like to paint a group as belonging to the good guys, to being on the side of the angels, and they don't really ask which angels, because the way God works is he isn't interested in power games. God has all the power politically, geologically, in terms of astronomically, in terms of anything you can think of. God has all the power. He has delegated some of that to us, and that means that the only party that's really interested in power is the enemy. God is dealing on an entirely different chessboard. He's working in a different way. What he wants is to draw people to himself. That's God's aim. That's what he's working toward.
Well, and it's a very interesting concept because if you imagine what I believe you and I both consider to be a appropriate depiction of a angel or demon, is that they may be greater in strength than a human soul, but the human soul has the extra power of choice. And what better way to get rid of that choice than a dialectic?
And that is a really critical point. That's sort of like the core of this thing, is that we as humans, when the enemy sets up a binary choice, a choice where you've got two options, like Republican or Democrat, like Trump or Biden, like whatever
Do a
you
worse
want.
one. Do a worse one for some poor imaginary figure where you've got a young man who's presented with two women from two families and that's your choices. No, no. I'm not gonna pick your two girls. I'm gonna go find the one that God's got for me.
Right. Well, and in this case, the I actually think the political one is a better description, because it shows the power game, right? This power game is not a power game between good guys and bad guys. It's between bad guys and worse guys. It's between people who are immoral, disgusting human beings, and people who are evil, immoral, disgusting human beings. There is no there is no side of the good guys in the dialectic, and that's the point. And so when we talk about these things, what we're actually talking about is, what is the manipulation game that the enemy is trying to perpetrate on us? And here's the thing that gets me. I'm just going to give you an example. I found a new news source the other day. Um, I'm not I can't call to mind the name of the news program right now, and it doesn't matter. But I happened upon an interview, and at some point, I actually may try to get a hold of the lady they were interviewing to have her on Modern Apocrypha, because she is
That'd be awesome.
a fascinating, fascinating lady. And she was talking about basically what is at the core of the deep state and how does it work and where did it start, and trying to sort of bring it into a modern age with some history. And it was an absolutely fascinating discussion that makes it very clear that nobody in the political game is actually working for the American people. They're all working for different power blocks that to some degree may go in the same direction as the American people's interests or not, but that the American people lost control of the American electoral system 100 years ago, and that it is so captured by other powers right now that are deep state powers, is what most people would call them. But whether they're, you know, private intelligence agencies or corporations or public agencies or, whatever they are not us, the American people. And the illusion that they're putting forward is that we are somehow in control, that we are somehow still the main characters in the story. And that's obviously not the case now. But what sort of surprised me, what I keep being surprised by over and over again when I find this stuff, is the fact that people don't internalize what this really means. Because I then watched a news broadcast where these same guys who did this interview with her were talking about current events and treating Trump as the good guy. They were looking at Michael Flynn and at the things going on around him as being the most important events in America in the last such and such, and the most important story to be told in whatever. And I look at this and I go, guys, this is a dialectic power game. It's nothing more than that. It is the enemy setting up two sides. One of them is going to knock the other down. It's all pretty much predetermined. I suspect Trump is going to win the election this November after some kind of heroic power struggle. That's my suspicion. I don't think it much matters, but the point is that none of this is real in a real sense. This is all sort of staged and manipulated by powers and principalities and spiritual forces of wickedness in high places. And that's a real thing, and that is the battle that we as Christians are intended to fight. Paul said it, and it's still true today, that we are not fighting against flesh and blood, we are fighting against these spiritual beings. And so when I look at people who should know better, which is everybody who claims to be a Christian, every single person who claims to be a Christian should understand this. This should be the core of their worldview, that we are in a fight not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers and principalities trying to manipulate us. And most people don't get it. People don't live that way. People don't see it. Instead, they're pulled into the dialectic.
Well,
Everybody
sure.
I know.
Well, and it's really
So
strange.
what do we
We
do?
shouldn't be. Well, maintain humility. I think that we spoke recently in a recent episode about putting yourself on a pedestal being a major flaw in our goals. Right? It's not about your ego. It's not about your growth. Isn't exactly the right word, but your status. Right? It's not about you. And so, if you go in and you say you're not doing the right thing because it's your party and they want to get mad, that's probably true. You can't get away with saying something outside of your network. You can't get away with saying something outside your party. You can't get away with saying something against your church, right? So when you've got a power
Well,
like
and
that, it's easy enough to see that you have a conflict of interest, is what we call it these days. But recognizing it and being humble enough to recuse yourself, we're failing at that.
well, and I think that the reason for that is that we don't have a worldview that actually takes the Bible's conception of our battle seriously as Christians. We have a worldview that takes the world's conception of our battle seriously. And that goes for every Christian I know. I mean, there are a few who are much less so than others. Like, you tend to be less so. My dad tends to be less so. I have a few uncles who tend to be less so, and a few brothers from other ministries that tend to be less so. But the temptation is still to get caught in that. And we as Christians have failed to create a culture that looks at the world in that way. And I'm left just, well, I'm going to have trouble explaining this to some degree, because the way my mind works is with connections, right? I see connections so intrinsically that words come secondary to me. But let me try to sort of explain how this works itself out. When you start to see things in the way the Bible tells us to, in the right way, instead of asking who's going to win the election, you ask, God, what do you want to accomplish through this power game that the enemy is trying to play? How can you work in your people's lives? How can you bring about your ends through the darkness that is perpetrated on us from, beings that we don't really have the ability to ourselves interact with? What is it that you're doing, Lord? And how can we act in the world to try to draw people to you and to love each other in this environment? Instead of getting caught up in the, oh, we need to go win this political battle. We need to be activists. We need to, whatever the thing that's in front of you is, whether it's abortion or, any of these other things, they are all important, but they are not the battle. The battle is with these spiritual powers. And when you win the spiritual battle, the other things fall in line.
Right. So here's a nice metaphor for you. You were born naked. Every day you wake up naked. You need to put on the cloth of Christ before you go into any activity you're doing. And going into all of your activities clothed will allow you to operate in those places correctly.
I think I would prefer to use a glasses metaphor, because people are looking at things. They may be operating out of a place of being Christians, because a lot of the people who are Christians and who I know do operate out of that. They have a heart for Christ and they operate out of that, but the way they see the world has nothing to do with the conception of the world that the Bible makes real to us. This battle is lost to them. And so I would say we wake up blind every day. And unless we put on these glasses that are Christ's way of seeing the world, we walk around blind and we wind up falling into things that we shouldn't be falling into. And when we put on these glasses, then we can suddenly, all of us, we can see some of the things that matter much more clearly. And when we fight the battles, then they're battles that matter. So let me give you an example of a battle that matters, that I think matters. I was listening to a Conspiracy Pilled Unhinged episode. Conspiracy Pilled is a great podcast. I highly recommend it to people. And I was listening to one of their Unhinged episodes about Ong's Hat. Okay, Ong's Hat is a tiny little town in New England where some very weird stuff went on, and if you actually want this, you have to go listen to their thing. I'm not going to explain it. But one of the things that PJ was saying on this episode was he's talking about how he thinks that we have this sort of, how we talk about how genes can be manipulated and how genes are sort of the individual units of how we as humans operate in the world, and or how we physically manifest, and how if you change the genes in a physical being, it changes their structure, it changes the way they act, it changes the way they manifest. He was talking about the relationship between that and memes in a culture. So the idea is, if a meme is a basic sort of unit of cultural expression, that as a culture, we have these things going on. It changes the way we express things as a culture, how the memes are transmitted between people. And he was talking, he got into epigenetics versus, is there something like epimemetics? And the whole question and subject is really interesting, but what he's talking about in essence is the same thing that I have been sort of buried in for the past couple of years, and that is, why do our stories matter? So I think that a battle worth fighting is the one for the stories that direct the way the culture moves. Politics is downstream of culture. Culture is downstream of faith. Myth lives between faith and culture. It points back to the faith we stand on, forward to lead the way for the culture. That's what I keep saying to people. I think it's true. But the closest anybody has come in the popular sphere is like Jeremy Boring at the Daily Wire saying that we need to create culture. Well, he's not wrong, but he has never quite clearly presented this notion of why we need to create culture. And that is that we as a culture look to our stories to create the glasses through which we look at the world. And if the way we're looking at the world is through a story that gives us the eyes to see the manipulation that's going on, then it's going to be a much more effective sort of understanding than if what we were doing was just looking at it the way we are now. And one way to do that is to change the stories, to change the culture. I think that's a battle worth fighting. It's a battle that I have invested my life savings and a huge chunk of my time into trying to start, you know, actually making an effort to fight. It's a fight that I'm trying to make. And so I don't think the political battle is one that's going to change much right now. I think that that is a function of powers and principalities setting up a dialectic. But if we can change the story, that could change things.
It's an interesting concept. We have
I don't know.
what seems to be a greater degree of conservatism among the youngest generation in America presently, right? The kids right now are more conservative than they've been since what they've been recording it.
That looks like a pendulum swing to me, man.
Does it look like a pendulum swing? I was curious if there was some hint of a story from their youth, from our youth that we brought forward to their youth. What was the thing that gave them the head start, if there was a thing?
Well, sort of a microcosm of what you're asking is I grew up around a lot of conservative Christian kids. And by the time we were 25, 30, most of those kids had grown up to be very leftist, very non-Christian adults. And it's because a lot of their parents didn't weren't they might have had real relationships with Christ, but the bulk of what they were was religious, and their religion struck their kids as being gross and not working, and so their kids walked away from their religion, and that caused a pendulum swing in the other direction. And I don't see any reason why the gross feministic culture that we have today isn't going to cause a pendulum swing in the opposite direction toward something closer to a Sharia law Muslim sort of culture. That's the best example I have. And it looks to me like where we're heading because of the craziness that's currently going on and sort of in its terminal stages now. So 10 years from now, I think we're going to see a pendulum swing towards something that people would not believe today if you told them, because of what's going on today is so gross.
So that there's not a story or some thing that might have affected them that in your mind it's just a reactionary feeling. I would hope that there would be some.
Well, okay, so you have to, when you look at story, when you ask that question about story, everything we do is a story. If I tell you how I went and got food for my family, that's a story. I tell you I went to the grocery store, I paid this money that I made cutting big pieces of metal into little pieces of metal and put it in the bank, and then eventually I used that stored up energy in the form of money to go to the grocery store and buy my family food. That's all a story, man. So everything about the world turns into a story, and it condenses down into a more and more pointed story as we get to where things are worse and worse in some sense. So what you're looking at in terms of things like MGTOW, the red pill movement, the all of the things that are pointed against the current feminist norms in our culture result from the collective story of damage that feminist culture has perpetrated on people. And so, yeah, there is a story involved, but to say that you can boil it down to
I
a
would
particular
supposition.
tale, I don't think is correct. Go ahead.
Interesting. I think we were in a East Berlin, with the bad side of Berlin. We were all in the bad side of Berlin for most of our lives, and then the Matrix reintroduced Plato's cave back to the mind space of the youth, and so they realized that even though it is a story, you're living a story. You get to pick it, and so they were like, "I don't want to play that game." Whereas before this, it was presented as reality, and I think that the Matrix brought Plato's cave back into the mind space of youth in a way that was culture changing.
That doesn't seem wrong to me. I mean, I think that what a lot of what the enemy does is they set up a natural reaction to something, right? So it's obvious to anyone who has watched human societies for more than a few generations that when you set up a force like this feminist culture, that it's going to create a counterswell. And if you can create the forces that will shape that and direct where it goes, then you can direct human energy toward your own ends. And that is what the powers and principalities have done. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think that that's what's gone on, but I don't think that it's a decision that they made purely. I think that there's a lot of action and reaction, and that they understand that they have to ride the tiger of the human mob mentality in the direction that they want to go. And sort of like, if they're tying fire to the tiger's tail, they better have some way of deciding which way the tiger's tail is swinging so that they can make it go the direction they want it to go. And that's what's going on a lot.
Right on. I can certainly see that
Um,
as
there we go.
a noted unexpected result, right? They probably felt that Plato's cave was a concept that had always been around, and they weren't going to hurt anything by playing off of it. And they didn't realize that quite a few people had no concept that the story they were living in they could change.
I don't know. I don't think whether or not the story can change is exactly the right way to look at it. I think more in terms of how much pressure is there on the people who are living in this society toward a change. And then once that pressure reaches a certain level, they create an outlet for it so that the people realize they can change things, and then they do change things in the direction that is sort of set up in front of them.
Do you feel like a dialectic
Hey,
is something to?
oh, I was just going to say, we got to go to break soon. Finish your thought, though.
Let me ask the question and we'll answer it when we get back. That's probably a good spacing. Um, so,
All right.
a dialectic is a preset um, synthesis so that you can get to the compromise end that you're hoping for, right? So you set up both sides of the comparison to get to a
Mm-hmm.
synthesis that you are aiming for. And so the dialectic is a battle that's been set up to provide an outcome, or
Yeah.
any outcome that comes out of it is acceptable to the person that set it up.
Is that the question?
No. The question is, if it's the case that set up battles are in and of themselves a dialectic, and maybe they're then bad just because they're a dialectic, is a 4-year election system in and of itself a dialectic problem? That's my question.
Okay. Well, let's answer it when we get back then. We'll be back in a minute, folks.
See you in a minute.
Hey, everybody. The Kickstarter is funded, and looks like we're going to be getting another anthology of characters from Brightstar, which is, by the way, one of the big reasons for Modern Apocrypha. If you haven't got a copy of Brightstar, or if you're interested in the anthology, head over to the website, e6universe.com. There will be more info coming up on that. If you're not on my email list, you should be, because I'm sending out info as new stuff comes available or there's new information. I am really looking forward to getting this anthology done. I currently have a tie between John and Rachel and Kevin as being the subject of the final short story for the anthology. If you've read Bright Star and you'd like to weigh in on which character you want to see a short story written about, please drop me an email. I'd love to hear. I need a tiebreaker, so let me know what you think. And just thank you, everybody. I just really appreciate your support.
I'd like to take a moment to thank all the people enjoying Modern Apocrypha. As many of you can see, I'm an avid coffee drinker, and I've been drinking North Arrow coffee for a couple of pounds now. You can find North Arrow coffee at northarrowcoffee.co, all one word, where they list coffee of the month and how green coffee is handled. I've been enjoying some of the number 4 Honduras and some of the number 10 Peru, available at northarrow.co. If you'd like to help support us even more, you can use discount code E6 for 10% off your coffee order today. Thank you.
And we're back.
Welcome back, everybody.
So, to answer your questions, I heard 2 questions. The first one was, is it that either outcome is acceptable or that any outcome is acceptable in a dialectic battle? And the second question is, does having a 4-year election system make us, is it sort of a tool of the dialectic system, or is it, something else? And so let me answer 2 different ways here. So the answer to the first question is that when you try to control human beings, it is not a simple exercise. You don't get to just say, well, you get one of 2 choices, because humans don't tend to respond well to that. Instead, what you do is you try to set up a system that directs people's attention in the direction of a particular set of choices. Okay. And that when you start to do that, tends to give you the ability to respond better to the choices they make. So it isn't that you get to decide which way they go so much as that you get to decide the questions that they're asking by creating 2 bandwagons for people to jump on. Okay. So it isn't that you get a guaranteed outcome, it's that you get to sort of direct their attention. And then if you're directing their attention properly, then the outcome that they come to is going to be acceptable regardless, because either of the 2 outcomes doesn't really affect the basic makeup of the situation. So, for example, we had this gay marriage debate 10 years ago in America, and neither side of that debate was a good answer. And most people are going to bristle at that. But here's why I say it. Because the question that mattered, the question that we really should have been focused on, is our religious freedom. Do we have the freedom to say, in this country, I can decide who comes into my church. I can decide who I bake a cake for. I can decide. And if that had been the focus of the decision, and we as Christians had been willing to say, you know what, these people are allowed to make their decisions, but they can't get married in my church, and they can't make me agree to what they have decided. And you will be able to see by the way they live their lives that they create hell for themselves by making these choices, and that they're unhealthy choices. But, that's their choice. They can make their choice. They just can't do it in my church, and they can't make me go along with them. If that had been the stand we took, then that would have been a good stand. But instead, everybody jumped on the anti-gay marriage, pro-gay marriage bandwagon. And when you're fighting those two sides of the battle, you lose the battle because the battle is somewhere else. Instead, the battle is taking away your right to say yes or no to what's going on in your community. Okay. So when we're talking about dialectic, that is a great example of that paradigm.
So it
And that's the
seems
answer to
to
the
me
first
like what you're
question.
saying. It seems to me like what you're saying is that the 4-year election cycle is not the problem. It is a party system that's the problem. The parties are the problem.
No.
No.
And this is where we get into right. This is where we get into the difficulty of the answer to the question. This is where a significant knowledge of history and an examination of history through this lens is really helpful. Okay, so if you go clear back to the beginning of recorded history, did they have parties, two political parties in Rome? Well, not exactly. What they had was something kind of different from what we have today. It was kind of a different system. Did that system play to the dialectic? Eventually. So
Eventually, yes. Yeah.
here's the way you have to think about the dialectic. The dialectic is like a virus. It adapts to its host's biology. The enemy's action is like a virus. It adapts to its host's biology. And then it slowly adapts its host's biology to itself by creating reactions in the host that make it easier for it to manipulate the host. So, for example, in Rome, what happened was it was originally a republic, it became an empire, and then over time, the empire structure worked fine for Rome for a very long time because their cultural norms and the way they did things was, reasonably okay, and they managed to conquer a big chunk of the world as an empire. What ended up happening was that the enemy sort of adapted itself to the Roman system and turned it into a decrepit sort of, the word isn't coming to me, but it's the same kind of thing we've got going on now. It's the extremes of just debauchery going on in the system. It changed the culture. Okay. I think that it wasn't a political thing at the time so much as a cultural thing because the cultural comes before the political. Politics is downstream of culture. Okay. So then you go to any other society. Let's come forward to America. You can look at any society through this lens to see how their culture was originally, that they became successful, and how the enemy adapted itself to that culture and changed it to make that culture
And
toxic. Politics
I
always
know,
follows the culture.
sure, sure. I know that you have some information or some study of the Ottoman Empire. Um, how did they
A
begin? And
little.
I know that um, falling apart of the educational system, right? Not understanding the new tech was the thing that got them.
You
But
mean you
the
mean the
downfall,
Byzantine Empire for the Ottoman Empire? The Byzantine Empire
yes.
fell to the Ottoman Empire. Well,
Oh, backwards. Okay.
that's yeah, that's part of the story, but the other part of the story there is really it's what happened to the culture first, and I don't know enough about the system to analyze it through this lens. I'm not a historian. Just I'm just a Christian guy with a specific interest in what actually makes the world turn and what makes things move. And my observation is that the changes in the tech are often something God uses to disrupt a system that is moribund and decrepit and morally depraved. Whether it's an invasion from somebody else or a change in technology, those are usually the tools God uses to break the tyranny down and break the enemy's hold on the system. So when it comes to America, we had a system, and American history is the one I know best. So here's the analysis that really will probably help people. We started with a system that was pretty well balanced to make it so that you would have to control all of the different parts of the system from top to bottom in order to determine political outcomes. Okay. And we saw a great example of this. This is how it was at the Revolutionary War time. This was the system we started with. When we came to the Civil War, that was when it started to break down. And here's how. We had a system where the states were a sort of a counterweight to the federal government. And the first thing that the enemy had to do in order to break down the sort of the decentralization of power was
The
to make
balance.
it so that the national government, right, the national government had primacy over the states, and the states couldn't effectively push back. And the best way to do that was by taking a moral issue, slavery, and forfeiting that moral issue for the sake of killing the political balance. So you have the South is actually on the side of decentralization of power, but they have this slavery problem, which is a moral problem. And so you can legitimately criticize the slavery problem and paint it as being the central focus of the Civil War. But when you do that, you lose focus on the idea that by by losing the Civil War, what the South did is they lost our decentralization of power to a great degree, to the point where the national was what mattered over the states, and the national had primacy over the states to a huge degree for the next 150 years, 100 years, okay, particularly 100 years. We've seen some resurgence lately, but the idea is that during the time of the First and Second World War, when a huge amount of our political structure as it currently is was developed, we had the national government being able to dictate the currency, to dictate all the different things on down the line to the states because of what happened during the Civil War. And when that was the case, it isn't that the two-party system is a problem specifically. It isn't that the four-year election cycle is a problem specifically. It's that in order for those things to work, they had to be in the context of the original framework of the Constitution, which was gutted when the states lost the battle against balancing the federal government.
As another example of this, the moral good of removing alcoholism created the Interstate Commerce Act. Right, it was prohibition
Mm-hmm.
basically that caused the Interstate Commerce Act, which is another basically way to reach into your home and and take your
Well,
kids
and
from
the
you or
same is
whatever.
true of Sure. Well, and the same is absolutely true of what we saw with the desegregation and the whole racial thing that came about in the early 1900s, where it was a moral problem that caused that, but what we lost was individual autonomy. And because of that, we still have the problems today of this school system that is basically more and more centralized on a national level, and is basically creating these factory settings in people that are absolutely squirrely screwed up, designed by the enemy. That's how the enemy works. That's how those powers and principalities operate. They manipulate the system to the point where the system is doing what they want it to do, creating the outcomes in the culture and in people's lives that they want it to create, so that people don't have a good worldview, that they don't have a good basis in morality. And in the case of America, the ultimate end seems to have been, as you put it, the co-option of the school system. And the way they managed that was by centralizing power on a national level, which then let them sort of determine curriculum all the way across the country through the national, public school system. And homeschooling has been a wild card there. It has been a really interesting counterweight.
Sure, sure. I agree. In all of these syntheses, as they've progressed, they have gone to create a larger empire, a larger government thing. Um, Where in the progression would you put the creation of the United Nations? Also, separately, could you see something like uh, the pendulum swing of the backlash against feminism coming in as a chivalrous movement to create a one world order to protect women?
You know, it's a really good question, and a sideways answer to the final question is yes, and then maybe it's a yes but or a yes and. Um, so the United Nations, it, the common conception of the enemy's plan for most of my life, most of the people who I grew up with, most of the people who I love believed that the enemy was trying to create a one world government, a one world political system by which to impose rules and power on people. Okay, and I think that that was a feint and is still a feint, and that we see that feint working itself out now. That one side of the dialectic is set up to be a a false front moving toward that centralized world government, and they did a really good job in the Soviet Union creating a vision of the horrors that await us down that road. The whole communism thing. People are ready to accuse any kind of tyranny of being communism because communism is the bugbear, and it is a really bad bugbear, man. It is terrible. But what we end up with when well, we end up losing focus on what God was trying to accomplish in the first place. So let's lay this out. One side of the dialectic is this push toward totalitarian centralization of control. The other side of the dialectic is sort of this individualistic freedom sort of thing. Okay. And
I disagree.
individualism looks pretty
Disagree.
dang good.
Disagree. Disagree.
Okay.
One side is the totalitarianism, the other side is chaos with damage. The happy individualism is the proper way.
No,
Really?
no, I disagree. Yes. Okay. What was the sin of Satan?
Pride and taking away from God, yeah, the wanting to hold power.
Happy individualism.
Okay. Not chaotic
So,
individualism,
so it
not.
isn't. Well, and here's the thing that here's the distinction I'm trying to draw. Yes, this happy individualism you're talking about is sort of the intended state that God wants for us, but it isn't a political option right now. The political options are individualism versus the communism, but the individualism that's being set up as a political option is one that is under the sway of the enemy. It is the enemy's end goal to make humanity over in his image, one of raising himself above the stars of God, one of making himself better than everyone else. And that is sort of the what they call the American dream, is getting as much power as you can when you take it to its extreme. And really that is the battle that we've lost, because God's intent all along has been to draw us into his arms, to show us who he is, to draw us into his arms. The result of that, the result of a relationship with God, is a happy individualism. It is one where he has given us our autonomy, he has given us our freedom. And it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. This is the intended end. And it sort of resembles what the enemy has concocted as a political option. But where we lose the battle is by seeing the enemy's version, the political version of happy individualism, as being good, instead of as being the enemy's sort of tortured version of what God wanted in the first place. And the straw man that the enemy has set up, this sort of totalitarian communist bugbear, as being the real enemy. So this is the end state of the dialectic, in my opinion, is that we are headed toward a thing where the two options are Either we're looking at a totalitarian World Economic Forum sort of woke Democrat leftist run utopia where we live in the pods and eat the bugs and whatever, and everybody's sort of becoming aware of that. That is the Great Reset, right? That is the core of the Great Reset. Or we get the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening is this happy individualism that the enemy has designed to look like a good thing. And so when we talk about scripture saying that there's a deception that the enemy has created that would fool, if possible, even the elect, that is the deception. The deception is this comparatively good version of the American dream where people are actually less materialistic probably than they were in the 90s or the 80s when the American dream sort of had its heyday. But there it is still sort of that 80s 90s America is sort of the end goal that the enemy is trying to put in front of us. Actually, that's sort of his utopia that he's trying to get us to vote for, to get us to move toward, to make us think that that is the golden age of the world. And in a sense it's really not so bad by most people's reckoning. The only thing you have to give up is your soul.
Right.
Well, and what we get with God is a much better picture, man. And let's paint this picture for people at the end here, because most people have the notion that Christianity is good in our audience, but let's actually paint the picture of where we're headed. In order to know God, we have to surrender our lives to his lordship, to Christ's lordship. We have to say, I want you to order my life, Lord. I want you to set my priorities, and I want to submit my life to you. And once we do that, then we start to get blessings, whether that's a financial thing or a relational thing or whatever. Everything that's good flows out of that, and he provides for us. And that doesn't mean that he wants to run every aspect of our lives. In fact, he really doesn't. When I ask God what I should do, more often than not, I don't get an answer, because the answer is, you decide, Jared, and I will bless you. And then when I get a no, or when I get a go this way, it's because it's an area that's important. So when I submit everything to him, occasionally I get an answer, and those answers matter when I get them, but most of the time it's my choice. I can choose what I ought to be doing, and he'll nudge me when I need to be changing what I'm doing because I'm heading in a direction that's not good. A couple of days this past week, I didn't work. I goofed off. I sat and played games, and it was because I was depressed. I was down. I was having a heck of a hard time. And I get into the second day and I'm like, I'm getting nudges. You need to get up and go work. You need to get up and get busy and do something. And I know why it is. It's because the more I play games and put off the work, the more depressed and, the worse the vicious cycle gets. And so if I get up off my butt and I go work and I listen to some worship music, then I'm going to be blessed in that. I'm going to feel okay about things. Life is going to be better. And that's sort of God nudging me in the right direction. It's not because he has designs on everything I do, because he wants to bless me because I am his. Instead, it's he wants me to go in good directions. And that's the case for us, both in a micro sense and in a macro sense. It's when we submit our lives to him, we have good things come into our lives at every level, and he will begin to conform us to his image more and more. And that's what I find, that as I submit my life to him, he conforms me to his image more and more. That's the Christian walk. And the same is true of society. So when we as a society are individually submitting our lives to Christ, we find that society begins to look better and better. Good things come out. it becomes impossible for the enemy to openly do debaucherous, disgusting things without that coming under justice. But when we
I feel
individually
like
do that
there's a
less and
space
less,
here. I feel like there's a space here for the way that the dialectic will move and change, like a virus, according to biology. That if you say anything forever, it's going to work its way in and make it dirty. Um, I'm not exactly sure um, how to put
well,
this.
there is an end to that.
Lately,
We know that the, well,
sure,
in
sure, we've had
Revelation,
the
we know
discussion
that the
before
devil
that.
that deceived them will be. Sorry, I don't mean to talk over you. Go ahead.
You're fine. I've looked at some of the video game statistics lately, and we both have a generally positive view relative to our parents about video games for minors, right? For people to use them as a social piece, as a learning tool for where in the world is Carmen San Diego kind of thing, right? There's lots of good things you can do with a video game,
Right.
but if you look at what's going on presently after the fight in the 80s and 90s about how it's going to hurt you or not, and they kind of sort of proved that it wouldn't, now it's gone to big corp mind, I want to use the F word, mind players. And you can see that the style of
Mind
games
control.
that kids, yeah, the style of games that kids are onto are less and less and less strategy based, less and less and less thought based, right? They're doing it somehow on purpose. Over the last
Of course.
5 to 7 years, we've had a massive decline in the intelligence of video game players. What?
It's true.
That's weird. It's weird.
It's true.
So saying
Yeah.
anything is
Now,
always okay, there's no always.
right. Well, actually, that's not true. And that's what I was about to say when I was talking over you, was that we know that the devil that deceived them was cast into the pit of the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet were. At some point, this nasty thing that is actually plaguing us is going to be locked down. It's going to be shut down. And when that happens, then we won't have this constant attempt at manipulation of us. That will go away. So there does come a time when that's the case, but we got some interesting times to go through before that. And what I want to finish up myself here with saying is that I don't think that that's going to look like a lot of people think it is. I think that instead of it being something that looks like a hell on earth, instead it's going to look like a battle that is a very serious, very difficult battle that the good guys win. And that it's those good guys winning, the light side of the dialectic winning, is going to fool a lot of people. It's going to make people think that things are okay when really we need to be looking to God. There's the parable of the I think it's the parable of the wedding feast. I don't remember which one exactly you call it, but in this parable, um, Christ and God invites people to the wedding feast, and they make excuses. They say, well, I'm in the middle of this and I'm in the middle of that. And they don't show up. The people who got the invite don't show up. And so he says, okay, go out into the streets, collect up all of the beggars and vagabonds, bring them into my wedding feast, lock everybody else out. And I think that that is a picture of, and there are other places that I can point to this, but this is the one that's been occurring to me most recently. That's a picture of what we're going to see at the end of the age, that we're going to see something that actually looks good coming out of the chaos. And a lot of people are going to get fooled into following it, and that we're going to have, we're going to have a heck of a time not following it. But that it is those who follow his call through that end up in a good place, that end up being, you know, being saved. That's what I think. And actually, that's a pretty good place to call it. Anything else you want to add?
No, that's got my mind swirling on a couple of scriptures, but nothing to speak on. Lots to think on.
All right. Yeah, same here. This whole conversation's been really stimulating. Thanks, Greg. And thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll catch you next time.
Catch you next time, everyone. Thank you.